There are circumstances where you can try to dry it the best you can, etch it and squirt on some triage, for example, a glass ionomer that is meant kind of as a pre-sealant until the tooth fully erupts so that you can get better isolation.
We could look at how to change behavior and how to improve implementation, not only from the individual provider perspective, but from the general healthcare system. Like, what can you do to change within a system so that you have an environment that is more inducive toward implementing novel things like sealing over an early lesion?
I mean, in the future, we may be sealing microcavitated caries lesions, who knows, but this is the first study of the type, so it's not certainly something we don't want to implement right away, but it's just something to look at for the future.
Get ready for your unofficial dental hygiene podcast. These are the tales of two hygienists, one East Coast RDH and one West Coast hygienist. Listen as they tackle the profession of dental hygiene with humor and enthusiasm. Now, please join Michelle Strange and Andrew Johnston as they tell you a tale of two hygienists.
So Andrew, I'm so excited that we are finally putting this together. We've been talking about engaging with the students for a very long time now.
Yeah, it's been a long time, and it's about time that we started really giving them the focus that they deserve, right? They're the future of our profession.
They really are. And we're excited that PDT has sponsored this episode because they do believe in the students being the future of our profession. They're going to be our colleagues, right?
Mm-hmm. You've heard about it in the past. We've been talking about PDT for a long time. They believe very much in quality education, and they've been sponsoring our episodes for a long time now.
Yes. And we think all of these episodes are actually going to be really great, even for the veteran hygienist. We really wanted to make these episodes and these roundtables focusing on topics that students are going to either be presented with when they go into new offices, maybe things that are happening during their time as a student. But, you know, how do they go and move from student to new grad to experienced RDH?
Yeah, so we're expecting to have episodes. Sometimes it'll be on instrumentation, how to adapt to certain angles, using an ultrasonic, maybe sharpening the instruments. And then other times we're going to talk about what types of offices that you're going to encounter, whether it's corporate, private practice, maybe a DSO. We'll talk about pay structures. There's just so much that's out there that you're right. Even the veteran hygienist is going to need to know these things as well.
And so we hope you enjoy this episode, and be sure to check out PDT, your Paradise Dental Technologies, because they have some of the greatest instruments.
Hey, Michelle.
Yeah.
It's time for the interview.
Oh, but I had something else to say.
We need to let the experts talk now.
Fine.
Well, we're really excited to have some of the smartest people I know on here. I was like, man, this is going to be like my favorite podcast yet.
It's going to be a good one. Mm-hmm.
It is. So we're talking sealants today. And so I want to welcome Jason, Spring, and Julie. And I'll let you each take a moment to introduce yourself. Jason, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back on the podcast. I am a dentist, practicing dentist in Robinson, Illinois, small town in the central eastern part of the state. And I've been in practice about 20 years, have been on and off of a couple different podcasts over the years, enjoy to some degree looking into the research and talking about it and bantering about it, especially with you two. So I have been to the EBD conference where I met Julie in person.
Yes.
That was one of the highlights of my dental career. And I think that's good for now.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. And you've been on at least twice on the podcast. Yes. So if you guys haven't heard that, go check those out too. Spring, welcome for the first time, but I feel like you're my best little science buddy ever.
Yes, I've really enjoyed our conversations about science, as I'm a huge science nerd. My name is Spring. I've been in dentistry my entire life. And by that, I mean, I started at the front desk of a private practice in my hometown when I was 17. I did assisting before I went to hygiene school. So I've kind of ran the gamut in the dental practice. I know nothing outside of dentistry, so don't ask me about anything outside of dentistry. But if it has to do with dental, I can probably help you out. So, and I've practiced in Florida, Louisiana, and I'm currently in Alabama in a small practice. And I've practiced in several different types of practices. So I feel like I can kind of relate to a lot of people. And that's probably about it about me.
Oh, welcome. And Julie, we are so happy to have you back on as well. And I am so excited and honored because I also still quote your book on evidence-based, dental hygiene, I guess, practicing evidence-based dentistry and dental hygiene.
Yes.
I forget the exact title. What's the title? I forget.
Oh, you know what? I forgot the exact title as well because there was a book and then I had a journal for a short time, but they're both in the realm of dental hygiene and evidence-based dentistry.
Well, welcome.
Thank you. So maybe a little bit about myself. So right now I'm working with a nonprofit group called the DentaQuest Partnership for Oral Health Advancement. There I lead our analytics and evaluation team. So I'm really doing deep dive in science all day, every day, which is great. And Jason and I have a little bit of a history together. He had his podcast that he was co-hosting for a while, and we had some time to banter together. And I think a couple of times I was a substitute host for you. So I'm happy to be on here, and I'm an avid podcast listener. So really happy to have this opportunity.
This is awesome. We're really excited to have you all on. And so let's just dive into it. Jason, do you want to tell us your article that you brought?
I'd love to. So I chose a literature review as my article because I wanted some variety. And whenever I was thinking about this, I was thinking about what material I used and whether I wanted to just find research on that to support my own choices, or I know that there's been several lectures where they talked about different types of sealants used in different circumstances, and I was wondering who's right. And so I thought this literature review would be a nice way to kind of catch myself up on where things were with that. And it was a lot better than I could have expected. It's called The Use of Pit and Fissure Sealants, a Literature Review by Naman, El Husseini, and Alamoudi. And it was published in December of 2017. And it's called the Dentistry Journal. I think it's Egyptian. So it actually talked about the history of dental sealants going back all the way to 1923, when things were first attempted to try to seal a pit and fissure. And they would prep them very aggressively, and brings us through the 50s, 60s, 70s, when a lot of research was done and the modern sealant was kind of officially discovered and then used on a regular basis. And then through the current state that we're in, where we have glass ionomers and we have resins and we have resin modified glass ionomers and we have like 7 generations of bonding and we have etch times that range from 10 seconds to 120 seconds. And so they talk about all of that. So it was really fascinating to see what we've been through and where we're at. So that part of it, I could talk for 2 hours just on that history because it was so interesting, but I'm going to skip ahead to the meat of the article that I took away from it. And that was that isolation matters. So if you are doing them yourself as a dentist or a hygienist, then you need to have a rubber dam on. If you are not doing them with a rubber dam as solo, you need to have an assistant that's helping you isolate. Isolation is critical for the success of sealants. That's something I have said in my own practice to my hygienists as they do place sealants, and they oftentimes don't want to bother the assistant. And so it has been a little bit of a battle, but we're on good terms, and I think we're doing good things. And the interesting thing is the article also, and this corresponds with some of the guidelines on the evidence-based dentistry website for the ADA, that there is really no good evidence on which actual material is best. They all can work well. They all have really good supporting data, depending on some of the different circumstances. So it seems, this is sort of my opinion, that if you have a little bit more of a wet environment, then you're better off using a glass ionomer and then keeping close tabs on it. If you can get a really dry field, then bonding it into place with, I think it was a Generation 4 bonding agent, was ideal. And again, it's limited data to recommend that. So it is low evidence to support it, but that was kind of the general recommendation. My takeaway then is partly that this is a couple years old, and so there are even more materials now than there were when this study was done. So they studied it in 2014 to 2016. They submitted for publication in 2017 and finally got published in December 2017. So I would be curious to know how the more recent materials, things like the bioactive materials and what they're able to do, how about that might influence some of this. And that's all. The end.
If I can ask a quick question about that, though, in the area where you're talking about the wet versus dry, and you said bonding it in, is this assuming that people are using a bonding agent prior to placing the sealant material as well? And is that supposedly common practice?
Right. So my opinion is it's not common practice for a sealant, and that it maybe should be. I think that it's certainly worth conversation. It's worth looking at further. I didn't go into more articles. I didn't try to scour the literature to find it. Hopefully Spring and Julie will add something to help us correct this or learn more about it. But I think that it really, to me, says that there are circumstances where you can try to dry it the best you can, etch it, and squirt on some triage, for example, a glass ionomer that is meant kind of as a pre-sealant until the tooth fully erupts or that you can get better isolation. And if we can really well isolate, then the gold standard would be to bond it into place. And the interesting thing, too, was that you don't necessarily have to prep it. This gets into the whole like non-carious lesions that look really suspicious, and even the mild, the introductory caries. This gets into caries classification systems that we don't use enough and probably should in practice. And we can probably safely bond over a lot more stuff than we think we can. But again, it gets into how we do it. So anything questionable, I do a little prep. I wouldn't call it quite a fissurotomy, although sometimes it turns into that, but just a little cleaning of that groove because it feels better. but the literature doesn't seem to think that matters.
So my topic is going to go into that a little bit.
Good.
Then I will save my follow-up question for that then.
Okay, I was going to say.
After I hear.
Let you take that, Julie.
All right. So the paper that I chose is called Barriers to Sealant Guideline Implementation Within a Multi-Site Managed Care Dental Practice. And I have to reveal that I am one of the co-authors on this paper. But by way of background, I was at the ADA when they developed their first evidence-based guideline on fissure sealants. And it was in 2008. And I remember the year because my son was born with the sealant guideline, and my daughter was born 2 years earlier with the topical fluoride guideline. So those are my personal landmarks. And then that guideline was updated in 2016. So one of the things that we actually recommended in both series of the guidelines is that pit and fissure sealants can be used for primary prevention, but also secondary prevention. So primary prevention is preventing caries when there is no evidence of caries, but secondary prevention is really sealing over those non-cavitated carious lesions. And so it requires diagnosing those non-cavitated carious lesions. And it requires, like you said, Jason, having the comfort of being able to have confidence in, sealing over these lesions. And so when we did the 2006 guidelines, we looked into things like if you sealed over early decay, what would happen? And we found some evidence that was published for the CDC that basically stated that, if you have caries, if you have strep mutans or bacteria in the tooth, you seal them over. They've really, they're anaerobic, but they've lost their touch with the world. So they're going to proliferate for a little bit and then they're not. So my paper, goes into why is that not being implemented a little bit more broadly? What is the level of discomfort with sealing over these early lesions? And looking at a new area of science called implementation science, which is really looking at the social science of how to get healthcare providers in any field to implement the best evidence in practice, because there are barriers, and it's not just in dentistry, it's in all of medicine. I've spent most of my life in dentistry, but I've had 2 stints outside of dentistry, one in hematology oncology, and the other one is in pulmonology. And you see these barriers throughout. And so that's a paper that I, will be talking about.
Well, go ahead and let's talk about that paper.
So the first author is Deb Polk, and this paper is supported by an NIH grant, and it's done under the leadership of folks at the University of Pittsburgh School of Dental Medicine. And NIH, the NIDCR, it's a National Institute for Dental and Craniofacial Research. That's the dental part of the National Institute of Science. They really wanted to get into implementation science, which, as I mentioned, it's the science of how to change provider behavior. And they had a request for proposal. And so this was, I think, one of 3 projects that were funded. The basis of it, like I said, was the Fisher Sealant guidelines, but there were also a couple papers that were published, I want to say maybe 2008, 2009, demonstrating some barriers, but also really focusing on the private practitioner. And what's unique about this paper is we're looking at those large multi-site managed care dental practices, which, as we're having a trend in dental service organizations and these larger group practices. And so one of the things that was really unique about this paper was that we could look at how to change behavior and how to improve implementation, not only from the individual provider perspective, but from the general healthcare system. Like, what can you do to change within a system so that you have an environment that is more inducive toward implementing novel things like sealing over an early lesion? This project is, like I said, it's a multi-year project. It's a 5-year project. It's funded by NIDCR. And this paper is really the first step. And the first step was understanding the barriers. And so it was simply a survey. It was a survey of all the general and pediatric dentists within one of the healthcare systems. And we wanted to understand potential barriers, and we divided it into 3 areas: practice environment, so the healthcare system; prevailing opinion, so that's more of the psychology and the environment within, let's say, dentistry that might impact people's opinion. And then we looked at barriers related to knowledge and attitudes. And so that's like, as a provider, what do I know and what are my beliefs? So again, the social environment, the specific healthcare system, and then the individual. One of the things that we found was when you talk about the practice environment, the biggest concern was liability. When we dig down further, it's a concept of, if I seal over early decay intentionally, and if that decay continues or that sealant fails, am I now liable? Right. So that was one of the big concerns. When it came to sort of the context of dentistry and that social impact or social influence, some of the barriers that we identified were being unaware of expectations of opinion leaders and unaware of the guidelines itself. So not only this survey, but other work that was done by Heiko Spellick and Ahmed Ismail. So Heiko was at Pitt, and he's now at the University of Sydney. He's their dean. And some work that was done by Ahmed Ismail, who is now the dean at Temple, really demonstrated that there was lack of understanding on the guidelines. And so, but those were based on individual practice, the small or individual practice provider system. This is looking at the healthcare system in a broader context, and also a lack of awareness of what's being taught in the dental schools. And then when it came to the individual barriers, and Jason, I'll be curious to hear your feedback on this, but suboptimal skills in applying sealant. So maybe many of these dentists didn't feel that they were able to do it correctly. And also lack of knowledge of different ways to manage these non-cavitated occlusal carious lesions. And so not being able to identify them and not being able to, even if you could identify them, know how to treat them. So those were some of the highlights, but I think that, I would be very curious with Spring and Jason, some of your opinions, especially on those two of how to apply sealants. Do you see that as a barrier and lack of knowledge on how to manage these early lesions?
Do I see it as a barrier for myself or in general?
Both.
I don't see it as a barrier for myself. I feel like my sealants are pretty successful. I don't have a real high failure rate when I place them myself. But I have worked with other hygienists that are not confident in placing sealants, and they do have serious concerns about sealing over a possible lesion. They've voiced that to me many times, different hygienists. And I see that a lot when I talk to hygienists. When I ask them about if they're implementing sealants, they tend to give pushback because they're afraid that they're going to seal biofilm or a lesion that's started and it's going to progress. And so I think that there is a barrier there for a lot of people, but not for me personally, but I've heard a lot of hygienists say that it is a problem.
So that's interesting to me because if they're fearful of sealing in an early lesion, yet we have 2 iterations of a guideline that says, yes, you can seal in an early lesion, that really shouldn't be a fear, that should be sort of like an intent. And so that's exactly why we're interested in this project, right? I mean, it's been since, 2008, this has been out there. It's been 12 years. And this is something that's not being implemented. So that's quite interesting.
Yes, it's kind of disturbing that we are still so fearful to do this, because the thing I really that frustrates me the most is, and I've worked with dentists that do this too, but they'll say, "Oh, well, let's watch that." I'm like, "What are we going to watch it do? We're going to watch it turn into a cavity, a full-blown cavity, whenever we could possibly arrest it or slow the progression by putting a sealant on there." I just don't understand that way of thinking, but I've seen it over and over again. So I love the fact that, you're looking into implementing and how to do better. And I want to learn because it needs to be done. Definitely.
Spring, it's hilarious that you said that. I had a dental school instructor, a prosthodontist, and he hated when we would say that we were going to watch something. So anytime we had a treatment planning session and we would say that we're going to put a watch on this mesial marginal ridge or whatever, that's exactly what he would say. What are you going to watch it do? And so you give me a flashback. I'm getting kind of hot and bothered now.
I'm sorry. That's exactly how I feel. Every time a dentist says, "Oh, we're going to watch that," I just drives me crazy.
I'm curious about Andrew's opinion in this too, because I think you've also had some issues with sealants. I don't place them, so I got no.
I do have opinions, but I do want to hear Jason's opinion first.
Well, the suboptimal skills thing, I think, is 2 different categories. I think when you're looking at dentists, if you have dentists that are claiming suboptimal skills for placing a sealant, then they shouldn't be placing fillings or crowns. And that's just, that's silly. And if
the dentist said that.
Yeah.
The dentist said that.
Yeah, let's go. He is a dentist on this one, guys.
Yeah. So if you have a hygienist saying that, I think that makes more sense, because most hygienists aren't trained in caries. And in most states, hygienists are not allowed to diagnose caries. And so just asking a hygienist to, go start placing sealants, I think is difficult for the hygienist. And it puts a lot of unnecessary responsibility on their shoulders without an appropriate education. And so once they are appropriately educated and trained and feel, I would assume, would then feel more comfortable and confident, that would make a big difference. So I think it depends on how they've been taught and approached to place sealants in the circumstances that they're doing them.
So I just want to weigh in real quick, and Andrew, I want to hear your opinion. But I think there's one thing that we have to acknowledge is that a dentist who is treating an adult who like sits still is very different than trying to place a sealant on a squirmy, wormy kid, right? I mean, that's really, really difficult for any, and I say that because I have 2 squirmy, wormy kids, and they're difficult. But anyways, Andrew.
So I think, Jason, I agree. I think to a large part of this is what I'm seeing, unfortunately, and kind of the problems that I'm having with, I see a lot of recurrent decay, and it ends up being radiographic by the time we see it. So there are these leaking sealants. And if you go back in the records, you look and see who's placing it, it's almost never the dentist. The dentist almost never places sealants in kind of our business model. And in other business models that I've worked at, I've seen this as well. It's always the auxiliary staff. And so when we have the, kind of a lack of training, me as a hygienist, I'm like, I really don't like sealants because I'm seeing X, Y, and Z, which instills that fear in me of then the responsibility and liability behind all that. So it goes maybe in an opposite direction that I don't want to hold responsibility if I know that's going to be the likely outcome. I do have a couple of questions for you guys later after Spring gives hers that is along kind of these lines of trains of thoughts. But that's kind of where I'm standing right now.
Yeah. And then I want to make one more comment on Julie. You mentioned that it's been 12 years. And I think, isn't the statistic that it takes 17 years to...
Yes. So the stat is it takes 17 years for new evidence to be incorporated into practice. And this is based on...
you still have 5 years.
Yeah, we still have 5 years, right? Yeah. Well,
wait, so are we ahead of the game? Is that what we're saying?
So it is actually really scary, but part of the joke is that you're just waiting for people to retire. So
right.
You can't really implement. You're just waiting for people to retire and things to change. But yeah, so I guess maybe we're ahead of the curve if you put it that way.
Okay, so we are ready for you, Spring. What did you bring to us?
All right, to bring it all home. So I chose a randomized controlled clinical trial that was published in 2019. It was prompted by a systematic review that was done in 2014 that in the systematic review, they were looking for non-invasive treatments to arrest non-cavitated carious lesions. And they came to the conclusion that resin-based sealants could stop non-cavitated carious lesions from progressing. So this randomized trial was put together because at the end of the systematic review, they asked for longer follow-ups because the follow-ups that they found in the systematic review were about 6 to 12 months. So they wanted trials that were a little bit longer. So this trial did a 24-month follow-up. So it was a little bit longer, but somewhere when they were making this randomized control trial together, somebody said, hold my beer, because they not only extended the follow-up, but they also chose 2 different types of sealant material to test to see if one was superior to the other. One was resin-based, one was glass ionomer. And in addition to that, they tested microcavitated lesions instead of non-cavitated carious lesions to see what the results would do. So they did that, and the participants were between the ages of 6 and 12, so they were children, and it wasn't completely blinded. They did exclude children with partially erupted first molars, and if they weren't systematically healthy or things like that. They had a great exclusion, but their exclusions were very good. They started with a baseline radiograph, and they used a customized positioning system with bite registration so that when they did the follow-up x-rays, it would be more consistent. And they had one dentist that specialized in pediatrics to decide who could be in the trial. They also had one person apply all of the sealants, and they couldn't blind that part because it was 2 different types of material. So obviously they would know the difference. And they came back at 12 months and at 24 months, and they checked to see sealant failure rate and if there was any progression of the lesions. And they made notes of that. And so in the end, what they came up with was the fact that as far as failures, only one failure, and that was in the glass ionomer. So it was, and what they defined by failure was that part of the sealant or all of the sealant was missing. And only one lesion progressed, and that was under a resin-based. But they decided that those results were not statistically significant, obviously, with 1 and 1 out of 151, which they did lose a few. I should mention that, which was expected. That's just the nature of the beast of, randomized controlled trials. But in the end, they decided that, yes, indeed, that there was not one material that was superior to the other, and that it is possible to stop the progression of microcavitated carious lesions. The one thing, though, I do want to mention about this, though, that I did find was a little bit of a shortcoming, is that they did not have a control group that didn't get a sealant. But in other studies, which I pulled up some information on that, is in the non-cavitated carious lesion studies, they concluded that there was a 2.6% annual progression rate with the sealant over the non-cavitated carious lesion, and a 12.6% annual progression rate for a non-cavitated carious lesion that did not have a sealant. So I think it's pretty fair to extrapolate those numbers to this trial too, but I really wish they would have just done their own little control so we could have had a better idea of that. And speaking of implementing and things like that, I chose this primarily because it's an example of how we progress into doing other things like sealing non-cavitated carious lesions. I mean, in the future, we may be sealing microcavitated carious lesions, who knows, but this is the first study of the type, so it's not certainly something we don't want to implement right away, but it's just something to look at for the future. So that's what I have.
Hey, Spring, can I ask you a question? We should raise our hand when we're ready.
Yeah.
Who's first?
Who's gonna?
Okay.
So you said they didn't have a non-sealant control. So it was a randomized controlled trial. So what were their control groups?
I'm going to be honest with you. I've read this study like 15 times. I can't figure out what they're considering their control. I really can't. So it kind of gave me pause. It did. It gave me pause. And that's why I wanted to mention it at the end, that was a shortcoming, that I just can't quite figure out what their control was, other than they did mention that they gave OHI. I don't know if they think that that's some kind of control. I don't know, but I don't think it's a good control at all. I mean, they don't have a good control. I'm just going to be honest with you.
So randomized control trial without a control.
Right, exactly. So it's a very interesting study, but I think that there's a lot of room for improvement.
Okay.
Did they describe the technique for placing the resin versus the glass ionomer?
Yes. And hold on. I'm going to have to look at my notes because I really do not remember that specifically. Hold on.
Can you share with us the study, like who's the author and the year?
Okay. Let me just say Cecilia Munez Sandoval. It's Sandoval. Carla Gambetta Tassini and Rodrigo Giacaman. Giacaman. I can't. I'm not even going to try. But it was published in the Journal of Dentistry. And it was published July 2019, if that helps. Any of that information. And, if you want me to, I can shoot you a link to it, to like my email, or you can put it, I can send it to Michelle and she can send it to everyone if y'all want to look at it. And you might see something that I missed, but I did not see what their, okay. Anyway, let me see if I can find how they put the sealants in.
While she is looking that up, I am curious if somebody can define for our audience microcavitation.
I think our dentist should define that.
Well, obviously it's smaller than a macrocavitation.
Oh, wow. Good definition.
Now that's crystal clear. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that as a formal term, but
like a measurable something.
Right. Okay. So can I, while we're waiting for Spring to look that up, can I use this opportunity to talk about not having formal terms, because it actually leads to something that happened in this NIH grant that we're working on. So we're working with these dentists and we're talking about non-cavitated carious lesions and white spot lesions. And there was a lot of lack of understanding. And I had this aha moment from a different article that I read, and it was in the linguistics world. So it has nothing to do with dentistry, but it was one of those fascinating things that you happen to find on like Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And this study was looking at understanding colors. And so they compared people who spoke Russian to non-Russian people and having consensus around the difference between blue and light blue. And it turns out that people who speak Russian really can say, hey, this is blue and this is light blue. There's a lot of consensus. They have agreement on different shades of color blue. But the people who don't speak Russian have a lot of variability. They can't agree on what's light blue versus regular blue. And the analogy for English is we can tell the difference between red and pink because we have the word pink. We don't call pink light red, right? But by having just that word and that definition, we have clarity. And in Russia, they have, they have a word for light blue that provides that same clarity. And so what we're realizing is in dentistry and trying to have these understanding a non-cavitary lesion, or like you said, a microlesion, if we don't have these terms and have general consensus on what they mean, that in itself is having a barrier. So I wanted to add some, quote, color to the conversation. Get it?
Good. I liked it.
Yeah.
So if I can ask then, and maybe this is, Jason, probably more your question. If we are using bonding agents and kind of along these terms of like classifying, being very specific, if we're using bonding agents for a resin-based material, is it now a permanent restoration? And what makes a permanent restoration versus a preventive, non-permanent restoration prevention tool?
My knee-jerk reaction is to say that that's semantics. I know that the sealant is expected to be a preventive tool, but you could say the same thing about a filling. You're trying to prevent the continued progression of a cavity. So to me, a sealant is a long-term restoration meant to prevent caries. So I don't know if I'm understanding or answering that correctly.
Yeah, I mean, it's open to interpretation. It's just I feel like when you have, your glass ionomer versus something you're actually bonding into a tooth, I understand that bonding agents are still kind of mechanical retention, but then you're having a chemical reaction also on top of that from the bonding to the sealant. Does that make it more or less of a sealant as a complete prevention tool within scopes of practices and things like that versus placing an alloy or placing, composite? Does prepping a tooth change that difference at all?
Some of this might get into, and Julie, you and I may have even had this conversation years ago about the fact that sealants are really effective when placed during a certain age. And if you miss out on that window, they don't have that much benefit. And so you could almost say that a sealant is meant to be protective between a certain age range when oral hygiene is challenging, when things are changing, things are erupting, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you can get clear of that, then it doesn't matter if the sealant is lost when they're 18 or whatever it is. There is research out there on that. And it might have been at the EBD conference that conversation was even had.
So it's tied to age, but it's really risk status, right? So you want to put the sealant on when the patient's at the highest risk, and the patients are at highest risk when the tooth comes in and when they're of the age of my kids where they don't want mom to be telling them what to eat and to brush their teeth and whatever. So that's a highest risk period. And so you're right. If you have that sealant in that gets them past that higher risk period and they age out of it. And here, I'm going to tell you a personal story. And so here's why I like to think of it as risk and not age. When I was pregnant with my daughter, I like to say that she was going to be a comedian, because here I am, a dental hygienist working on evidence-based guidelines on sealants and topical fluoride and whatnot. And there was only one thing that made me throw up. And do you know what it was?
Toothpaste. I could not brush my teeth with toothpaste. And I was like, oh my God. And it would just make me so nauseous. And so I would brush my teeth with water, and I was using a fluoride rinse, and I was doing my best, and I would try different flavors of toothpaste. And at one point I was like, the 8th month, I was able to use cinnamon flavored toothpaste. But guess what happened?
You got
a
cavity.
I got a cavity. I had a small early lesion. Of course, I was like, well, is it a non-cavitated lesion? Could you put a sealant over it? And the dentist at the time said no. But then when they went to do it, it wasn't a big lesion. So maybe it could have been. But the point is, caries risk can change over time. And if you have someone who has an occlusal surface that has no restoration on it and something happens, I wish I'd gone and told my dentist about my problem earlier so I could have had maybe a 5,000 ppm toothpaste or done something different. But caries risk does change over time. And now everybody who listens to your podcast will know that I had a cavity. Oh no. Maybe you can edit that out.
I mean, I have fillings, so I can't.
Me too.
I can't judge.
I think risk is a really important piece of this puzzle too, that you just bring up, and that this lit review paper talks about risk, and they actually only recommend sealants in high risk patients, not every patient. And that was something that I hear mixed recommendations on who should get sealants. And if you just blanketly say everybody, then you're all of a sudden taking risk assessment out of it.
So that's one thing that's really interesting between the 2008 and 2016 evidence-based guidelines on sealants, because the first one did have risk stratification, right? And the new one doesn't. So it's interesting.
I think it just makes it confusing. It's valuable, but it's confusing.
Yeah.
So they're supposed to update the evidence-based dentistry model for sealants this year. So I'm interested to see what changes are made on that too. But what was your question about the placement of the glass ionomer? Did you want to know how they placed it? Is that what you were asking me? Well, I'm going to just read to you what it says because it would be easier that way. So the enamel was conditioned with polyacrylic acid using a fine brush, rubbing it over the lesion for 15 seconds, washed with a moisturized cotton ball for 5 seconds, and air dried for 5 seconds. The commercial presentation of the glass ionomer used was capsules, which had to be mechanically mixed for 10 seconds. Once mixed, an applying tip was placed to the capsule and dispensed from bottom to top of the pit and fissures. Glass ionomer sealant was compressed against the tooth by digital pressure for 2 minutes. Excess material was then removed with manual cutting instruments and a probe without the aid of rotary instruments. So that answers your question.
That's a way to do it.
That's a way to do it.
That's a way to do it. That's why I said I'm going to just read to you what they did. So,
no, that's good.
Thoughts on that, Jason?
No, that is I think a long way to say the way that glass ionomers are meant to be done, and etch, dry, squirt it in.
Yeah.
With too much pressure.
Yes.
Yeah, but so that was a technique. I'd never heard of this technique before, but there was a technique brought up in this paper that talked about squirting the glass ionomer in and then using finger pressure to force it in down deeper.
I actually was looking up doing a paper about microleakage of sealants, and it talks about how much more successful they were using pressure, the glass ionomers. I didn't end up doing that one, but it did. Yes, I read one too that said that.
Makes a lot of sense, actually. We had, a pediatric dentist that said, and it's always with glass ionomers, and sometimes we had those wiggly worm patients that Julie was talking about earlier, and we would be doing like the facial. And so I did restorative hygiene, and so we'd be working on the facials of ENF or something like that, and he'd be like, all right, Andrew, just go ahead and put some Fuji in there and the world's best instrument, meaning my finger. Just do that real quick, and we're good to go, and hope for the best.
That's what proctologists say too.
Well, I think we actually answered one of the bigger ones because I was going to ask about the risk factors, because Michelle and I were offline having a conversation about healthy, like my kids, very low risk. They do have some kind of deeper grooves, but they use Sonicare, there's fluoride, there's all the things. I look at their teeth all the time. I feel like their risk is even lower than most kids. Do they need sealants? Do they not need sealants? And so I feel like we kind of answered that one basing off of risk and things like that. I wanted to know, going back to the fissurotomy one, though, actually, it's something that we used to do quite regularly in pediatrics. where we called it a composite sealant or a comp seal, but it was never any anesthetic or anything like that. And I was wondering if anyone had any more information on that, like the effectiveness versus non-effective. Is that too invasive? Is it not invasive enough?
Okay, so for me, what I've done in my practice to balance this out for my own emotions is that I use a diagnodent to help me to screen these. And if it is over a 20, but under a 30, then I do a prep sealant. And that's what we call it in our office. I prep it, the hygienist seals it. And if it is under 20, and also there's some visualization that goes into that, how extensive does it look, or dark or ugly. And if that's under 20, then they're good to just go ahead with a sealant. And if it's over 30, then we start off calling it an occlusal filling. If it ends up being really small, then I'll downgrade it to a sealant after I'm done.
So, Jason, why not just seal over it?
Well, again, it depends on the size. So that gets into the diagnodent variation and lack of really precise numbers for lesion size. So I find that this range between like 20 and 40 can sometimes be elusive. And so I've had ones that score a 25 that I end up dropping into this monster, and I end up thinking I'm doing a prep seal and I have to anesthetize. And so something like that, I don't really want to just seal over. I would rather clean out some of it. And I'm okay with making sure I have a periphery of nice enamel that I'm bonding to and then sealing in some decay. But I want to make sure I have a periphery of clean enamel.
Sorry, I'm going to let Andrew finish this. I'm sorry I can't stay for the whole thing. I'm really kind of bummed. But thanks, guys, for coming on.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Okay. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.
This is going quickly. Gosh, I just looked at the clock. I feel like we just got started.
It's like that every time. Yeah, it's just so much fun. But Julie, was that kind of what you were asking?
I guess, Jason, so are these lesions that are non-cavitated?
Not always. That's the difficulty.
Okay.
Is that there are times, and that's kind of what I'm alluding to with the diagnodent reading, is there are times where I go in and it is a cavity, but I didn't know that it was going to be. And there are times when I think it's a cavity and it's not. And so that happens enough that I'm not comfortable just sealing everything, like having a blanket statement of we're just going to seal it no matter what.
But these are ones where with an Explorer, lightly, because you don't want to go real hard, but with an Explorer, you would not have called it cavitated, but you're deferring to the diagnodent to make that diagnosis for you.
Yeah. So 3 things. I do: visual, appearance, tactile, so the Explorer, and then the diagnodent. So the mixture of those 3 things leads me to a decision of whether I seal something without prepping or whether I prep.
So maybe I'm going to suggest that we have another podcast talking about diagnodent and diagnostic tools in general. Because
you and all that.
Yeah, because there's the false positive rate is something that needs to be considered. And then you get into like the restoration cycle. So once you cut into a tooth, you're kind of I'm going to use a strong word, but condemning that tooth to probably getting, restored over time and getting bigger, lesions. And then I'm going to share another story where, I didn't see the dentist until I was 6 years old. One of my parents is an immigrant and this wasn't part of their lifestyle or their kind of upbringing. So my first visit to the dentist, I had nitrous and I had 4 occlusal fillings on all my first molars, and then nothing since then until my son was born. So I got good after that, but I now have a crown because one of those occlusal fillings had to be restored in my 20s because it broke down. And it was bigger. And now I'm 29, but I turn 29 once a year, every year. So now that I'm, quote, 29, I had a crack and I have a crown. And so, if that could have been prevented or sealed, it's the lifelong trajectory. And so I think when it comes to some of these diagnosis tools, we need to think about false positives. And I say that from my dental perspective, but most recently, my last job, I was in the pulmonology field and we're looking at lung cancer screening. And so there's also, any type of screening for anything when you're using these diagnostic tools, you need to consider the false positives. So that'll be another podcast. Okay.
Yeah, I think we should do that. And I'll tell you what I would do is if we do schedule that, I will do, once it's scheduled, I'll take photos of my next 10.
Okay.
That I seal.
I love
and
it.
I'll tell you the decision I made, and then you can critique it and say that
I'm not going to critique it. We're going to discuss it. But I think those photos will work really, really well on a podcast. Yeah. Don't you think, Andrew?
Absolutely. Like, hey guys, let's describe with words the thing that we're looking at. It'll be fine.
So the interesting thing though is we could do that by having somebody pull up on their screen the ICDOS thing, and we could say, what I'm looking at is this, and that would be the image of what we're looking at. And so I think it would be doable.
So Andrew, do your listeners know what ICDOS is?
I mean, probably students that we're doing this really deep discussion for is probably not.
Jason, you want to define ICDOS?
Well, I don't use it on a regular basis, so I actually pulled it up so that I could be fully informed for this. It's the International Caries Classification and Management System is the new terminology for the actual caries classification and recommended management. They have a whole website as well that has stuff kind of like the EBD. So it's a classification system for caries.
Yeah, so bringing that analogy to our discussion about color, right? So that classification gives us the language to distinguish between blue and light blue.
That's right. Excellent.
So in regards to what you're talking about, what Julie was talking about getting a filling and it progressing and being worse, the paper I did, the randomized control trial, they had a very specific word they used for that, and they called it the restorative death spiral.
Oh, I love that.
And I thought,
I need that word.
I love that term. Yes, it's totally my new term. I will be using it from now on. So I wanted to share that with y'all since it was brought up. I meant to say it whenever I was doing my paper, and the second thing I just wanted to mention was in my last practice, we used Diagnodent. We did exactly the way Jason was talking about. My daughter's tooth was borderline, and the dentist I work with, who was absolutely amazing, he said, "It's your call, Spring. What do you want to do? You want me to try to do a filling, or you want to seal it?" And I said, "You know what? Because I'm a hygienist and I can monitor this, I'm going to seal it." And that was about 3 years ago. And she still has sealant on that tooth and nothing has progressed. So it's so hard to make that call whenever you're, it's crazy. It's a difficult call to make.
Well, what I love about that story is that, the dentist gave you the option to explain the options to you and hopefully explain the evidence. Yes. And then you made the decision. That's what evidence-based care really is, you have a clinical condition and circumstances, you have the evidence, and you let the patient make the decision, but it needs to be an informed decision. So it's a nice story.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say this only because I really love him and he's a great dentist, but I probably am the one that told him about it.
I love it. Even better.
And he would be okay with me saying that. Trust me. He's great. But I probably was the one that said, "Well, let's talk about this." But he was fine with my decision. So that's what we did. And it was great. It was good.
I'm a little haunted to think how many teeth I've sent into a restorative death spiral.
I think that's going to be the title of this episode.
I think it should be. Totally.
Restorative death spiral.
I might need some dental handcuffs, Andrew. So one other thing I wanted to touch on that came up in this paper was the effectiveness of doing varnish on a regular basis in pit and fissures compared to sealants. And this paper, they only referenced one article, so it's not as powerful as the sealant data, but it had a 3-year follow-up, and 17% of the varnish group developed caries and 19% of the sealant group developed caries. So they were saying that in some circumstances, especially low to moderate risk and not high risk, you could use a varnish instead of a sealant.
I usually think of varnish as prevention for smooth surface and sealants for pit and fissures. And I love varnish too.
The studies I've read, same thing. It said that it was really good at smooth surfaces, but pit and fissures, it wasn't so good at preventing cavities, the varnish. That's interesting.
I think, though, because they weren't putting digital pressure on that varnish.
There you go.
Yeah, you know what?
Good to go.
That's probably true.
I rub that stuff in. I don't have the details of the study, so I'll have to look it up.
Because I think varnish is great, and it's looking at their frequency. With higher risk, it's more frequency. So I'm curious. I would love to probe that a little bit further, because, like I said, I think of varnish for smooth surface and pit and fissure or sealants for the pit and fissure. But yeah, interesting.
And that was kind of along the lines of my last question, anyways, though. But in addition to maybe varnish, is there anything from the panelists that you think is equivalently good? For example, varnish or SDF or some of these other things out there to a sealant for pit and fissure procedures?
Well, it's modifying risk behavior. So I would also have conversations about food and drink frequency and quality and their habits at home. Given if they are high risk, then, especially if they're high risk, then they have the bacteria in their mouth in enough quantity to cause cavities. So how can we alter that? And so going through all of those things to try to alter the risk profile would be a part of that discussion of the sealant and varnish.
I'm currently somewhat in the public health field, and I did public health work before, but you also need to consider things like social determinants of health, which are not as readily modifiable, although there are certain things that you can try to do to overcome some of the social determinants, such as teledentistry, bringing healthcare to the community or the schools or whatnot, dealing with transportation and things of that nature. But it's really a complicated situation. And you mentioned SDF. I think that's an emerging technology. Unfortunately, there's some side effects with the staining. So, there's some limitations there, but that's certainly something that can be used.
I agree. I think all of those things are very applicable as far as caries prevention. So I would probably do the same.
So Julie, you made me think of a story. So I had this dad brought his two little girls in. One was 6, one was 9. And the 9-year-old has a history of some bad caries and multiple extractions. And she is a fireball, just back talking. They just moved here from Arkansas. They have a thick accent. And, well, I think they have a thick accent, Spring. And so,
so they may think you have one.
Yeah, right. So we're talking, and the girls are just loud and obnoxious, and they're like wild, and they were hilarious too. We had a lot of fun, but they would not sit still. So the dad finally says, "Girls, I'm going to trade you in for something quieter, like an airplane." Thought that was hilarious. But the sad part of the story was that they both said, "Hey, do you give free toothbrushes?" I said, "Yeah." "Can we have one? Because we don't have one at home."
I know.
It's like, oh my gosh.
Story before.
So yeah, I said, anytime you need a toothbrush, just come by. We'll give you a toothbrush. She's like, "And do you have toothpaste too? Because I don't have toothpaste." It's like, oh my gosh. Okay, here's some toothpaste. So you talked about the social determinants and how impactful, like that comment, I'd never heard that before. I'd never considered that somebody would not have a toothbrush. So that was really sad, really eye-opening that there's something happening there that we need to get stuff out to people. So what a profound impact.
I've heard stories like that before, and I heard a story of a family who everybody shared one toothbrush because they couldn't afford one.
Oh.
And we don't think about that because we don't think to ask, right? Because you just happen to find out. They mentioned it. I mean, you wouldn't think to ask, but we should, right? Thinking about also priorities. I mean, when you talk about social determinants of health and you're telling somebody that they need to come in every 6 months and they, need to brush teeth and they need to do all these things. And their biggest priority is, I need to have somewhere for my family to sleep tonight and I need to give them food. Right. And so when you need to give your kids food, I listen, you listened to the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, right? Right, yeah. Jason? So Steve Novella said, bad calories are cheap, right? So it's really cheap to go to McDonald's and feed your family and, sugar sweetened beverages, right? That's really cheap, but it's not the nutrition that they need. And, one of the things that I've come to appreciate as I've continued to be 29 over the years, but got wisdom anyway, is that I need to consider some of these things a little bit more and be more sensitive and be open to asking the questions and just understanding a little bit of different circumstances.
Well, as we wrap this up, does anyone have any last thoughts for our audience? Knowing again, they are students and new grads generally.
Ask more questions.
I would say always be inquisitive and be open to change your mind when faced with evidence.
Oh, Julia, love that one. The evidence. Yes. Just because you learned it in school doesn't mean that you do it your whole career.
Bingo.
Yeah. Yes. And try to avoid sending your patients into a restorative death spiral. That's my advice.
I love it. If any of our listeners wanted to reach out to you, how might they do that?
I don't know. Email, I guess. JLUCHTE@hotmail.com.
So I'm going to say email as well, but my email is really long, as is my last name. So I'll spell it out, but you may want to, I don't know if you have show notes, but it's FRANTSVEHAWLEY@gmail.com.
And mine would be email as well. It's really, really difficult. It's springhatfieldrdh@gmail.com.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much for your time, you guys. I really appreciate it. Appreciate everything that you brought with you. And I think everyone's going to be better for listening to the show.
Thanks for having us.
You.
I want to let you know that I'm going to send all of you an invitation to help me celebrate my next 29th birthday.
Yay.
Well, I just celebrate my 21st every year. So it's,
Oh, wow. Cool. You're younger than I am. Jason, what do you celebrate this year?
Oh, I have no qualms. 45 coming up soon.
Love it. All right. Thanks, guys.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.
Good night. Bye.
We hope you really enjoyed that roundtable, and be sure to check out PDT Dental. Head over to their website, Paradise Dental Technologies, and if you're on the show floor, going to trade shows, go see them. Check them out. They're great, great people.
And a special thank you to the guests that were on this episode. Feel free to reach out to them as well. They have a lot of good information for you, and they like to be contacted. So you'll see their information in the show notes.
And be sure to follow us on Instagram or Facebook. You're welcome to send us messages through either of those social media platforms. And you can send us a message at atale2hygienist@gmail.com. You can even email us directly, either Michelle at atale2hygienist.com or Andrew at atale2hygienist.com. And head over to our website and subscribe to our newsletter, atale2hygienist.com.
There's a theme going on there if you haven't been able to tell. And also, we're always looking for ideas for student roundtables. So if you're a student and you have a specific topic you want us to tackle, please reach out to us. Let us know.
We appreciate you for listening, and we hope you have a great week.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, y'all.